Welcome back to the FM Garage, where in this video of our Stage 1 Turbo Kit installation series, we're going to cover installing the turbo manifold and outlet assembly onto our engine. What's that? Oh, you're ready to put a turbo on the engine. Okay, all right, okay. Let's do it. So now we've got the engine bay cleared out. Don't forget to pull your rags out. These aren't good for boost, so we won't need these. Now, included with the kit is a new exhaust manifold gasket. This is a Mazda multi-layer steel gasket. Now, this guy is essentially symmetric front to back. The only difference is that this window has no opening on this side, but it does on this one. It doesn't make any difference for these engines. You can install it this way, or you can install it that way. Makes no difference. So make sure that when you pull this out of the bag, it should be nice and clean. Don't fold it. If you put any creases in it, that'll almost certainly guarantee you an exhaust leak. Now this guy simply slides over the studs on the head, just like that, hangs in place. The last step that we need to do before we mount the turbocharger, the manifold, and the outlet onto the engine is to loosen up this nut. That nut holds the engine mount on the driver's side to the subframe. So by loosening that, that's going to give us just a little bit of wiggle room, so that way we can rotate or rock the engine up and away from the driver's side frame rail just a little bit to help us out when we mount the assembly onto the engine. So all I'm going to do here is loosen this up to the point where the nut is still held on by a couple of threads, and that should give us just enough room to be able to rock the engine. Now we don't want to take this off all the way, because if you rock the engine and you have taken this off, you may actually pull that stud out of the subframe, and then whenever you go to set it back down, you'll have to try to locate it again. Not that that's necessarily wrong, but this saves a little bit of time and you don't have to try to guess at stabbing that stud through the subframe. Now, because this is going to be a somewhat tight fit to get this in here, we've already notched the frame rail. That was done in an earlier episode, but we still need to be able to give ourselves just a bit more room. So how we're going to do that is that I have a floor jack under the car with a piece of wood that's on the oil pan. So I'll jack this up just a little bit. You have to be careful that you don't try to jack it up too much, because right now it's on a lift. You probably have it on a lift or on jack stands. You don't want to jack up the engine and actually lift up the rest of the car with it, because when we loosen the nut on this engine mount, it's only loose, it isn't all the way off, and the other side's not even loose at all. So be very careful when you do this if you use the jack method. Another method that is useful is to have a big pry bar. So this method works fine. You may need to do a combination of both, but if you have a second set of hands, employ them to use the pry bar. Now what we're going to do is insert this pry bar between the power steering pump housing bracket. So there's this bracket right here, and then there's this little space between the bracket and kind of the water pump, really. So we're going to slide it down in there. And then the other portion of it is going to go up here between the valve cover and the head. Now in this engine, you've got basically a little eyelet mount, so that way if you needed to crane the engine out, you have somewhere to mount it to. You can take this off, or you can leave it in place. It doesn't really matter. But this will give you a nice place to be able to push and rock the engine from the driver's side over to the passenger side to give yourself a little bit more room. So I'm going to use a combination of these two to be able to get this in here myself. This is definitely one of those jobs that if you have a second helper, this can really make your life a lot easier, but you can do it by yourself. So let's go ahead and we'll jack up the engine a little bit, and I'll show you how to put the turbo on the engine. Now, when we jack up the engine, it's not going to move a whole bunch. You're going to see it lift a little bit and hopefully rock over towards the passenger side just a touch. We're not looking for miles, we're just looking for a little bit of lean. So again, be careful when you're doing this. Don't lift up the engine with the rest of the car and throw it off your jack stands. There we go. Do you see how it just moved a little bit over? So it would come out a little bit more, except for that I still have the nut on that stud on the engine mount, so that way I don't have to try to fight it to get that stud back into place on the subframe. So that's all we're looking for right here with the jack, just enough to be able to rock the engine over just a touch. All right, this octopus is ready to get put in its aquarium. So you have a lot of hoses hanging out here. You kind of need to keep an eye on the oil drain line as you feed it down in there. And this is a fairly heavy unit. So again, if you have a pair of hands to help out, this can definitely be a good time to do it. You also have your other coolant line over here. So just be aware that this doesn't get caught up on too many things as we're dropping it in, because we will need to feed it back up and then attach it to the turbo when it's on the car. So these two ends of your coolant lines, just keep them over here out of the way. And then carefully start with feeding your oil drain line down behind the compressor of the AC system if you have it. Now these hoses that are coming out front, I'm not really too worried about their placement right now. All they're doing is just hanging out, and we'll finally adjust them when we get to that point. This is going to be a little bit of a Tetris act. So now, when you get to about this point, you're going to start running into stuff like the frame rail, this bolt. So if you haven't taken this out already, you might also consider doing so. You don't have to. You just have to maneuver around it a little bit. So now, we're down to about this level where the back of the manifold is sitting against the face of the studs. And you can see that down here the frame rail is still pretty tight. Now, on some cars, by jacking up the oil pan, you may have enough room to be able to simply slot it on from here. On this one, we're going to need to also go ahead and use the pry bar method. Before you get even that far though, make sure that your heater core hose, the one that we bent earlier, is pulled back and down a little bit out of the way. You don't want it on the stud between the manifold and the head. If you put your manifold over the top of that bracket, you're going to have a really loud exhaust leak and not make a lot of boost. So, simply going to feed this pry bar down in here like this. And we're going to be able to rock this engine up and out of the way. Be careful of your fingers. So we just need to come back and down a little bit more. And see, I've got this coolant line that's loose, just hanging out right here. You can have it down underneath the turbo if you want, but if you keep track of it like this, you don't have to try to fish it up and through after you got the turbo mounted. There we go. So now the manifold is mounted onto the head, or at least it's over the studs anyway. So now these guys, just like the factory one, we are going to use the same exhaust manifold nuts. So these same ones that we took off earlier for the factory exhaust manifold, we're going to reuse here with the turbo manifold. So I like to go ahead and get these guys just started. That way you can get the manifold all lined up and flush against the head before you torque it down. There is a torque sequence to these nuts, just to make sure that you get the flange straight and flat, and that you don't have any accidental warpage by starting on one end and getting it too torqued down before everything else is attached. Okay, now that we have all of the nuts started here, I'll go back through and get them, not tight, but I'll just get them all to where they're holding the manifold and turbo assembly flush against the head. And then we'll torque them down starting in the middle and kind of work our way outwards. When we do that, that'll help to even the load that's being torqued on this flange, and that'll help prevent this flange from warping as you torque it down. all of the nuts that are attaching the manifold to the head are now down, not tight, but they're just run down so that way the manifold is up against the head properly. So now we're going to go back and torque them all in kind of a from the middle outwards kind of pattern. It's not super important that we go from the middle up, middle down, anything like that. We're just looking to start from the middle and spread our way out. Now you could see that from that time lapse that this is a tedious process. These are all 14mm nuts, but they're pretty difficult to access in some cases. I actually had to use a number of different tools to be able to get to all the different locations. And that's just one of the things on this particular manifold, because it is a log style manifold. It does have tight spaces between the manifold and the nuts. So cozy up to the fender, well, you'll probably need to be there for 15-20 minutes tightening up these nuts while you're here. But in the end, it'll be all worth it, and it's pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead, we'll torque down these nuts, that way we'll be done on this part. I'm going to start with this bolt that's way down here. You have to access it from the bottom, but this is the middle nut, excuse me. So I'll use the stubby wrench on this one because that's the best way to access it. Now there is a torque spec to these nuts. You can use the factory torque spec. If you can get to it, is the problem. On most all of these, you can't really get a ratchet or a socket, except for maybe the front bottom ones, and sometimes the inner bottom ones. So if you can get the torque spec on them, that's great. If you can't, these are large M10 studs, so you can pretty much get them nice and tight just by hand, and that should do it for you. Now that we have the turbo manifold and then the drain line all situated and attached, I'm going to wrap up a few small things before I attach the EGR pipe. So earlier on, I had taken out the little retaining nut that holds the dipstick tube to the little sheet metal piece between the transmission and the back of the engine. So I'm going to reattach that. I'm also going to reattach this grounding strap that attaches to the same stud, just to get these things going. These aren't required to remove them. I simply did this just so I could move this tube around to give me a little bit more wiggle room with attaching the manifold. So they're both held on by a single nut. I'm just going to go ahead and put that back on and tighten it down now. It's very important to reattach that grounding strap if you did take it off to begin with. If you don't, you may run into some trouble popping fuses or blowing relays later on down the road because you have insufficient grounding. Now that that's attached, let's go ahead and we'll get our EGR tube that is new for this kit attached to the manifold and the intake. This is the EGR pipe. On this particular car, the 2001 to 05s, there will be a new EGR pipe that's included with the kit. The 94-97 cars will have a slightly different looking, well, same basic premise, but slightly different shaped pipe. The 99-2000 cars can actually reuse their stock EGR pipe. So all of them, because we're using our turbo manifold, will have this male threaded section here. This will go onto the exhaust side, of course, and then the same 2-bolt flange that will bolt to the intake housing. The 90 through 93 cars don't have EGR equipped from the factory, so you guys get to skip this part. Before we put this on the car though, because this is an exhaust component and it does have threads, I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on these threads. This is a high temperature copper-based anti-seize, and just want to do a light coating, nothing crazy. I like to do after applying it is just make sure to spread it evenly and wipe off any excess. Most of this that is not trapped between the threads will simply burn off anyway. So to keep the amount of smoke down, I just like to wipe off any extra. Now from here, we will thread this guy in the back of the engine. I'm going to do it from the exhaust side. However, your particular car may need to have it threaded in from the intake side. So try whichever way works best for you. All right. So on this side, got two little bolts or studs. And they fit on just like that. And now I've got everything pretty well lined up. I simply need to torque the fittings down. Since I have the studs on that side, what I'm going to do first is take the two nuts and simply thread them on. I'm not even going to worry about really threading them down all the way. I'm just doing this to keep the flange from coming off. There we go, that's all I'm looking to do. I'm leaving the intake manifold side very loose. You want to have a little bit of play like this because these are large threads here on this EGR fitting, and trying to get them lined up with the threads in the EGR port on the manifold can be a little bit difficult. I'm simply going to be threading in this fitting while moving it around up and down. You may even need to pull on the pipe a little bit or push on the pipe to be able to get the right orientation. It is a thin wall tube, so you don't want to really bend it all over the place, but it is a thin wall tube, so if you need to flex it just a little bit, that's okay. Okay, so I can feel that I've got it started. It's not quite perfect the way that the hose is routed, which is all right, but now that I can feel that the threads are started, I'm going to get back in there with my wrench and start tightening that up. Okay, you want to get that guy nice and snug. There's a lot of threads, so it'll probably take you a little while to get to this point. But once you do, give it a good snug. And now we'll head around over to the intake side. Now this one, all we have to do is tighten down these nuts. Since we've already partially installed it, this is pretty straightforward. Snug them down with a wrench or a ratchet. And these are M6 studs, so don't go ham crazy on them. Just snug is fine. And that's it for the EGR tube. So it's installed. The last thing that you need to do is make sure that you don't have any contact between your heater hoses and the EGR pipe or anything else back here. So I'm just checking to see if we have any real contact or any kind of issues. Everything feels pretty good though. I don't see any contact anywhere that we need to worry about or feel anything that is in danger, because that tube will get hot with the exhaust gases running back through it. At this point, if you want to, that little P-clamp that we took off earlier, you can slide it back on and bolt it down. It is not an integral part of the system, so if you want to, you can also simply leave it off of there. It's not going to hurt anything. The last thing we have to do with the turbocharger and the water lines is hook up this outboard banjo. So we left this off to be able to install the turbocharger, give us a little bit of room, that way it wasn't rubbing up against any of our frame rail or anything like that. Now that we have everything in and seated properly, we're just going to put this in place. So we have our banjo bolt with a crush washer. So I'll fit that through the banjo fitting. And then take the second crush washer, install that on the threads. With the banjo assembly together with your crush washers ready, simply feed it down here in position, line up your threads, and snug up your bolt. Now before I tighten this down for real, I want to make sure to position the hose that's going down away from the turbine housing. Of course, this is going to get very, very hot, so you don't want it to be contacting or leaning up against it like that. You want to have it pointing basically straight down if you can. This is a 19mm, or you can also use a 3/4 wrench or socket to be able to tighten this down. And we're just crushing those washers to give us the seal. We don't have to go crazy on it. There we go. And now that water line is finished up, and we're ready to move on to the next task. This is the stainless steel downpipe that's included with our Stage 1 CARB legal turbo kit. So this is a polished stainless steel 2-piece downpipe. This is the end that attaches to our cast outlet housing on the turbo. And then on this far end, we got a 2-bolt flange that mates up to your stock mid-pipe and catalytic converter. This particular downpipe is for an NB. The NA design is a little bit different. This and the NAs, of course, both have 2 oxygen sensor bungs. Now, you can use one of them, you can use both of them. In either case, you're going to have 2 plugs that are included. You'll likely have one left over. But generally speaking, we will thread in the factory oxygen sensor in the front bung, this guy here. And then if you plan to run an aftermarket wideband sensor, if you want to do any kind of AFR monitoring, you can use the second bung here right before the catalytic converter. So if you don't plan on using a wideband sensor, then you can simply use one of the included bung plugs and thread it in here to plug that off. Before we do anything with these guys, I've gone ahead and cleaned up the threads of the oxygen sensors that we're going to be threading into these pipes. And I'm going to apply just a little bit of high temperature copper anti-seize. Now if you do apply anti-seize to a sensor like this, be very careful that you don't get it on the actual sensor element. That very well could ruin the sensor for you. We're reusing the one that came out of the car because it was in good shape. You may, if you're not sure of the condition or mileage of the one that you take out, you may want to actually replace this sensor. So also, before we put it in there, a lot of the excess thread anti-seize here is just going to burn off, so I'm just going to wipe it a little bit. And then using a 22mm wrench, I can tighten this down into this bung. And it's much easier to do this out of the car. Otherwise, once you get it in the car, space is tight. Either way, you will want to do this with the connector undone, because if you try to spin this up and tighten it down, you'll likely twist up these wires, which isn't great. So same thing with this sensor. We are going to use an aftermarket wideband sensor in this particular setup. I've cleaned up the threads. If you're using a brand new one, of course you shouldn't need to do this. But again, I'm going to apply a little bit of high temperature copper anti-seize paste. Being very careful to avoid the sensor. And likewise, this has the same threads, same thread pitch. So this simply gets threaded into this lower bung. And then for both of these, they both use the same 22mm hex. I can just tighten them down. And now they're ready to install in the car. We won't attach them together like this. It'll actually be a little bit easier for me to get this one piece mounted in the car first, and then we'll mate this section, the lower part, later on after I've got this loosely installed and get everything lined up and then bolt it all together for good. Now we get to finally install our new 2.5-inch stainless polished downpipe. So this guy, I've already got the sensor in position. You can install the sensor after the fact if you like, but it's a little bit easier out of the car, so I choose to do it beforehand. And I'm just going to thread it up through from the bottom. And then just like this, it's in position. Now you can see there's no gasket there. Again, these are machined mating surfaces, so there is no gasket that you need to be able to use between these two pieces. So you simply mate them up like this, and then we will put on the locking hardware. So first that goes on is going to be one of these Nordlock washers. It's kind of these two-piece guys with the grooves in them, just like we used on the outlet. So feed those onto the studs first. And then the lock nut goes on. And then just repeat this for the other 3 studs. Now that we have the initial portion, or the first section of our downpipe loosely installed, now we need to install the slip joint section. So you can see we already have the wideband oxygen sensor plugged in here. You don't have to have this for the stage 1 kit, but we're choosing to have one because we want one mounted in the car. This will have the slip joint side also with a clamp. So now that this is loosely installed on NBs, there's 2 studs on your mid-pipe where the catalytic converter is, and these studs are pressed into this flange. So you don't need to use the included hardware that came with the downpipe. If you have an NA, or if you have an aftermarket exhaust system, then you'll likely need to use those included bolts. The included bolts, washers, and nuts, you can see these stainless steel guys that are included with the downpipe. These are Imperial, I believe they're 5/8 and 11/16 size. If you're reusing the stock hardware like we are in this case, then you'll just reuse the stock nuts, which are 17mm head nuts. So for these guys, what we're going to do is I'm going to pre-install this clamp, just sliding it over the first section so that way it's on and out of the way. And then the second section here, the slip joint, go ahead and slide that on. Okay. And I'm just making sure to keep all my wires from getting tangled. So you'll be able to manipulate a little bit of movement forward and back with the stock exhaust system because you've got rubber hangers down there. If you have aftermarket exhaust system, you may need to do a little bit of finagling to get everything lined up just the way it needs to. But in our case, just a little bit of wiggling back and forth is all you need. Now, included with the downpipe is a gasket. So this is the first gasket in the exhaust system here that we've been using, just because at this point, this flange is not a super hot area of the exhaust like it is closer to the turbo. So we get to use a general, just regular exhaust flange gasket in this case. On NBs, because of the way that they have this, they use what's called kind of a donut gasket. And if you still have the stock one, you can certainly use it here if you get a better seal than with the flat gaskets. NAs always use the flat gaskets. They don't have the donut gaskets like the NBs do. So in either case, use whichever gasket gives you the best seal. You may need to do a little bit of trial and error. Just test this once you have the system put together and you start the car up for the first time to see if you need to switch from one gasket to the other. Now I'm going to slip the included flat gasket onto our catalytic converter and mid-pipe section here. And be careful not to bend this or crinkle it. If you make any kind of a crease in the gasket at all, you'll likely have a leak. So try to keep it as flat as possible while you are manipulating it and installing it. All right. And then in this case, like I mentioned, we're going to reuse the factory nuts since the studs are part of the flange on the factory NB exhaust here. And I'm just doing these up by hand. I'm not going to tighten them down just yet until I have everything in position. So now that we have all of the hardware loosely fit on the downpipe towards the outlet side as well as the mid-pipe side, you can see that I still have some play. There's still some movement here, and that's good because one, we want to make sure we have clearance up here where space is tightest around the bell housing. Now, if you come over here and take a look, you can see that in this particular instance, the 2.5-inch downpipe, I actually have plenty of clearance here on this side between the bell housing and the downpipe. And then over here, the other part that you'll need to pay attention to is having enough space between the downpipe and the chassis. I actually have quite a bit of clearance here on both sides. You can see I can fit my fingers down between the gap on both sides. So on your downpipe, you'll just want to make sure that these are the two spots where you're likely going to run into the most clearance issues, and so you want to make sure that you have enough space between these components so that way you don't get exhaust rattling against anything if you're too close. Generally speaking, you want as much clearance as possible, but if you have at least about 1/4 of an inch, you'll likely be fine with stock rubber hangers. So once you've got everything in the position that you want it to, you can start tightening down the hardware. Generally, we recommend starting with the hardware that's closest to the engine and then working your way back with whatever bolts or nuts that you've loosened along the way. To be able to really reach the lock nuts that we just installed on the downpipe connecting it to the outlet, I like to be able to use a long extension or possibly a couple of extensions. You'll want at least 18 inches, maybe a little bit longer to be able to get adequate reach. I also have a universal here on my extension as well as a 13mm socket. You want to get at least a medium depth, if not a deep socket, to be able to tighten up those nuts and still have enough room whenever the stud protrudes through the nuts once they're tight. Also beyond this, you'll probably want to get a hold of a stubby wrench. So this is again a 13mm. This will really help me reach the nut that's on the back side of the outlet here, because even with the extension and the universal joint, sometimes it's just too tight to be able to get this tool in around here. So having a stubby wrench will really make your life easier. Now I'm going to simply insert this tool up from the bottom. You'll just have to kind of thread your way up through until you're able to get the socket on the nut, just like that, and then snug these down. So as you're doing this, keep an eye on the alignment of the downpipe. Make sure that you're not accidentally tightening this down and forcing it over to one side or the other to make contact with the bell housing or the chassis. Now we have the downpipe connection to the turbine outlet tightened up. Just need to feed this oxygen sensor wire back up to the engine bay. So we won't show you that here. Now we're going to work our way back between these two connections, the flange and the slip joint. So on the slip joint, this actually gives me a little bit of freedom to be able to move the exhaust system closer together or possibly spread it apart to give us more of an alignment here on the back end. Obviously the front end's not going to move anywhere since now it's bolted down, but if you need to, you can push these together or pull them apart just a little bit to be able to make alignment here. So things I'm looking out for is just making sure I've got room here between this flange and the transmission tunnel. And then the further back you go, just kind of give it a look over and make sure that you're not hitting anything else or running into any other parts here. Looks like our clearance is good. So I'm going to get this clamp lined up on the flange, and you're just looking to get it pretty close to the edge here. You can see this is the edge of the two slip joint pipes, and I'm going to rotate it so that way when I tighten down this nut for the clamp itself, that it's going to be up and not hanging down below the car where it might be hit if you run over a pothole or bump or something like that. We have our clamp in position, and now I'm just going to tighten up this nut. This is a 15mm nut, and we're just looking to get a nice tight pinch on this band clamp. You can see that it has kind of an I-beam looking joint here in the middle, and that's just going to get pinched by these two pieces of metal, the strap that surrounds our exhaust pipe. Okay, so you can see here there's still a little bit of a gap between them, but I've got a nice tight pinch on this clamp. You don't need to go Hulk on it. We're just looking for a good tight snug of that nut. So now that that is in place, the last thing to do is tighten up our nuts here for the last connection between the downpipe and the rest of your factory exhaust. So on NBs, these are 17mm nuts. I'm simply going to use a wrench and tighten these down. All right, so last thing that we need to do here on the bottom, if you have a wideband oxygen sensor that is run up through here, we generally will run this up through the shift boot. That's the easiest way to get it inside the car. If you've got a long enough one, you can of course run it up through the engine bay. It's up to you, but do that now before you get out from underneath the car, and then the exhaust will be done on this portion of the stage 1 turbo install. Back up top here in the engine bay, we're ready to install the oil feed line onto the top of the turbocharger. So on both the NAs and NBs, all versions will have a 90-degree swivel fitting. And this is what's going to attach to the top of the 7/16 by 24 male inverted flare. And then this is going to be the end where our dash 4 line is attached. So before we do anything and put this on the turbocharger, I'm actually going to apply just a little bit of oil to the threads and to the flared face. And this is just simply to give it a touch of lubrication. These fittings do require just a little bit. You don't have to go crazy. And once we've done that, this is ready to go on top of the turbo. So here, I'm just going to thread this down on top. Okay, and you can see here, it's starting to get tight, and as you tighten this, it's pulling against and seating this swivel against that flare from the fitting that's actually threaded into the turbo. So before we tighten this down, make sure that you have this fitting pointing pretty much directly at the driver's side fender. This piece, this hex portion, is a 9/16, so you'll need a 9/16 wrench to be able to tighten it down. Basically, once you've got it finger tight and you've got everything located where you want to add about a quarter turn using your 9/16 wrench. There we go. So if you turn it more than that, you're likely going to damage the seat or the flared face where it connects to the adapter into the turbo, so you don't want to over tighten it. Now that this is in place, you can see that our swivel here is fixed. You can no longer actually swivel it. So I've actually got it pointed just ever so slightly forward. You may want to come back here and double check this, or at least make sure that the position of that fitting works with the routing of your feed, your oil feed line. So this is something, if you need to, you can come back in here and check it up later after you've got the heat shield on, just to make sure you've got clearance. Now that we have the adapter threaded on top of the turbo there, we're ready to install our oil feed line onto that adapter to complete the circuit. So I've just threaded in this little plug here just to keep any kind of oil from dripping in the engine bay while it was sitting here. I have this routed basically underneath the master cylinder, the brake booster, and then over here just in front of the cruise control. Your particular routing may be slightly different, so find which works best for you. This particular routing though will be applicable to the 1996 up to 2005 Miatas, where we are sourcing our oil feed from the passenger side of the engine block. The 1990 through 95 and Mazda Speed variants have the ports on the driver's side of the engine. So yours will actually come up from underneath, and then right here, kind of in between the compressor and the turbine housing, it'll come up between the pinch weld here on the frame rail and the turbocharger. But on the later models, we'll be having a longer line that gets fed through here in the engine bay. So route it wherever it works best, and there's not a pinch in the line. Pretty straightforward, but yours may differ a little bit from ours. So the same thing with these guys, because this is a flared fitting, this is a dash 4 line, we'll want to apply just a little bit of oil here to the threads and the face. So I'm just going to apply a little dab of oil with a finger. and just rub it on the threads and on the face. Doesn't take a whole bunch, so you can apply it directly or like this on the end of your finger. Either is fine. And now that we have that lubricated, we're okay to thread on our oil feed line, like so. And then same thing, I got it finger tight. And now about a quarter of a turn, and that is good to go. Now that we have the oil feed line installed, we're going to do one last thing just to protect the engine bay and other components that that line is rubbing up against. Because this is a stainless steel braided hose, it's going to chafe through anything it's touching. So there's several components right here that it's running past, and it's all, touching in a few different places. So to prevent that, we have a length of rubber hose that's included with your kit. So this rubber hose, what I've done is I've simply split it open all the way down, and this way I can slide it over that stainless steel braid, and this rubber hose will prevent that braid from chafing through anything here in the engine bay that it's touching. There we go. So you may need to position this a couple of times before you get it just right where you want it. Once you have it set where you can see that everything that it's touching is covered by the hose, so that way it doesn't chafe through, then you'll take the included clamp, just a little pinch style clamp, and you'll attach it onto this hose. Now this isn't terribly important where it actually goes, because all this is just keeping that rubber line from falling off. And then these little clamps, it's either a 7mm or you can use a Phillips screwdriver to torque them down. And once you've done that, that just keeps that rubber hose from sliding around. So set this back into position, and we're good to go on this one. So if you have a 1990 through 95 Miata, instead of having this hose routed here like you see on this one, this hose you'll just use it on the section that goes past the frame rail, just to protect this stainless steel braided hose from rubbing up against your frame rail and chafing through. So just use that section. It'll be a shorter section that goes right here, right below where the turbo is sitting next to the frame rail. Our oil feed line is now attached to the turbocharger, and we're ready to move on to the coolant lines. So also, before we do that, just to make mention, I have gone ahead and plugged in our oxygen sensor that we were talking about on the downpipe. I ran that wire back up here and simply plugged it back in. Some of the earlier models, it looks a little bit different, but they're all have a plug in roughly that position. So don't forget to plug that sensor in when you're done. On these hoses, if you've got the soft lines like what we've got here, these are the rubber lines with the silicone inners. I've already got them routed over the top of our power steering pump. If you have a car without power steering, this will be a little bit different. You'll have a little bit more room. But I'm routing them over the top. I've got them zip tied together just to keep them from flopping around so much. And you can see I've actually already cut these to length. So you'll have quite a bit extra, and you can trim as needed to get the right fitment. But these guys, I'm just going to route to this position here, right off the thermostat neck. And then this position down here, which is the water pump inlet. If you haven't already, get a bucket down below the car that'll catch the coolant, or at very least have a rag handy, and then take off the stock pinch clamps for these hoses. And then you can see on this particular car, there's a little bracket here, just a little piece of metal clamp that you can unbend. Okay. And that stock hose won't be reused, so you can just take that guy out altogether. Now that the factory hose is off, we're ready to attach our new coolant lines from the turbo. So this shorter line is the inboard hose. This should go here on the thermostat neck. And the outboard hose, this longer one that I've trimmed here, will go onto the water pump inlet, the other side of that hose that we just took off. So on the routing here, if you haven't already attached up your outboard banjo bolt, do so before you cut this to length and make sure you have the right lengths. And I would also recommend attaching your outboard hose first, since it's down low, and if you do it the other way around, it'll likely be in the way. Now before we do this, put your clamp on first. That'll save you some headache. And I've also greased the inside of these hoses just a little bit to make this a little bit easier. Don't go crazy, just a little bit of grease to help you get them on. Now, this little clamp just needs to slide down over the barbed portion of the nipple that we just attached to. All right, got the hose in position with the hose clamp. So that's a 7mm or a Phillips head, so whichever way is easier for you to tighten that clamp down. And I've just got this clamp positioned right behind kind of the bead or the bulbous section of that hose bar. Now for the last hose, this is just going to feed right over and attach your hose clamp. I'm actually going to feed it on first because the NBs have a slightly larger diameter barb. And then all right. So now that we have both hose connections on here, you can do up the little stock hose retainer here if you have one on your timing belt cover, just to keep that hose from contacting the belts or the pulleys here. So we recommend that this is attached somehow. An easy way to do that is simply to take a zip tie and attach it to this bracket for the power steering pump. You can also use like a P-style clamp and attach it to this bracket or this bolt. That way it's locating it and not able to flop around. So in this case, because it's a simple place and we've got extra zip ties, I'm just going to attach it here to the power steering pump bracket. And this doesn't affect the movement of the bracket. We still can move the bracket up and down, see? But this keeps these hoses located so that way they're not flopping around in the engine bay. So attach them as you see fit and you're done. We have the turbo, manifold, and outlet mounted up on the engine, and now we need to tighten up the nut for the subframe attachment where that engine mount bolts through. So we loosened it to be able to rock the engine up. Now we need to be able to tighten it back. So it is just a small 14mm nut, just like what we saw before, and just gonna tighten it up. Okay, so you'll notice now that we've reinstalled the AC compressor, and this is so that when we hook up the hose, that we make sure that we've got our lengths and the routing just right. So at this point, if you did remove your AC pump, make sure you put it back in on the bracket. You should have your oil drain hose that has been threaded down here, just waiting to be attached to the hose barb. And just like we did up top on the oil drain flange hose barb that attaches at the bottom of the turbo, we are going to apply a little bit of grease. This is just to help us get this hose on there easily. Don't have to do a huge heavy coating. And to give yourself an extra helping hand, you can also grease up the inside of the hose just a little bit. Just looking for a light coating. And then before you do anything else and put the hose on here and don't forget your hose clamp. So this is a constant torque hose clamp that's included for the soft oil drain line. It looks like in this particular case, orientation is going to work out best to have the hardware end of it hanging down. So you can either pre-slide this onto your hose, or if it makes more sense, like in this case, because of all the stuff that's going on here, I'm actually going to hang it here on the hose barb itself, and then simply thread your hose on. Now with this particular setup, it's already trimmed to fit in this case for this car. If you have any excess, you want to trim that now. You don't want to have any kind of dips or low sections in your hose, because if you do, you'll have oil puddling up in this hose, which could eventually back up to your turbo and cause you to have lots of stinky blue smoke coming out your exhaust. So once you've got it trimmed to fit and you can get it set up around your compressor housing, find the best layout that works, then you simply need to slide the hose over the barb and then fit it on all the way. There we go. And then, as you can see, the end of the hose here is butted right up against the hex portion of that threaded barb. And last but not least, simply need to do up this hose clamp. This is an 8mm head on all these constant torque hose clamps. And just like the other constant torque hose clamp that we did before, once you see that all the washers are bottomed out against each other, this clamp is tight. Don't need to go any further because you may strip it out. So now your oil drain line is connected and it's all done. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the Stage 1 Turbo Kit installation series. In the next video, we'll cover intercooler and intercooler piping installation on this car. So if you have any questions or need any help, feel free to leave us a comment down below. You can also call us or send us an email as well. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.